So what is IFC? We're part of the World Bank Group, owned by 183 member countries, based in Washington, D.C., and we have about 3,500 staff working across 100 offices in 92 countries. So large footprint, all emerging market focused, and the mission is really to look at a couple of different areas with the end goal of alleviating poverty. We're looking at frontier markets, including IDA countries like Africa. We're looking at climate change, so very relevant for this audience. And we're looking at sort of inclusive growth and private sector growth in financial markets, in infrastructure, healthcare, education, etc. In terms of the 2011 highlights, to give you a sense of the scale of which we're operating, we have a committed portfolio of about 55 billion, about 1,700 plus portfolio companies, and invested about 12 billion for our own account, and 4.7 billion was mobilized. I think this year, our fiscal year-end is June. We're looking at a combined investment, I believe, of around 20 billion, but we'll see what the numbers end up looking like. We've also raised a separate asset management company that's got third-party funding. So the funding that I mentioned before was all from our shareholders. This is a separate vehicle that raises capital from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and other entities in order to, in many cases, piggyback on IFC investments. We have a very active advisory program, and advisory for us is sort of an in-house consulting. So what we do is we work with portfolio as well as other companies in terms of helping with things like capacity building, different types of services that will help extend our development impact in these different areas. So what we look at is a sort of a triple bottom line. So what we used to say was we focus on a double bottom line. So that would be commercial returns. There was some discussion earlier on sustainability, and that's a very key part of our theme. We don't continue to raise capital. It's evergreen capital because our focus is on sustainable investments that give returns that then allow us to plow it back into new portfolio companies. The second part of the bottom line we look at is on the development side. So any investments we make have to have a developmental agenda focused on it. And then now with the climate change aspect, that's sort of the triple bottom line that we're starting to look at to make sure that all three areas get hit in this area of the investments that we're making. Why is climate change important to IFC? I'm probably preaching to the choir over here, but just to recap a couple of specifics. So resources, as we know, are all interlinked. There's rising demand as wealth is increasing, in particular across emerging markets, driving pricing. We're seeing a lot of this in India and China. In India in particular, commodity pricing has been rising rapidly, and this has the primary end sort of focus ends up being on the poorest people who have the greatest impact on them. So we realize that climate change is a very, very important aspect of our work, and which is why we're increasing our focus on this area. Here again, the slide is showing how all of these areas of climate change are interlinked between energy, food, water. Choices need to be made, and I think overall, as we're targeting these different sectors, need to understand how to sort of ensure that there's efficiency across all these different areas. Looking at emerging markets now, what we're seeing, which is good, is that a lot of discussions are being led by emerging markets. Now, of course, between Rio before this, Cancun, etc. I think on the policy side, there's still a lot to be done, and I won't get into that part of this discussion. But what we're seeing is that a lot of countries are taking up the challenge on their own, and a lot of specific initiatives are being undertaken in different countries. In India, for example, you've got the various national missions covering 8 or 9 different areas of climate change. The national solar mission is probably the most well-known and probably the most successful so far. We're also expecting under the National Mission for Energy Efficiency, the PAT scheme that's led by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which is targeting, I think, the top 12 polluting sectors, industrial sectors in India, and ensuring that companies need to comply with the reduction of pollution. If they don't achieve this, there's stiff penalties, and if they either have to pay those penalties or buy credits from other companies that are exceeding their performance targets. So I think this could lead to a very interesting market, very large market in India, both from a trading aspect as well as more energy efficient processes, products, etc. Emissions growth is fastest in emerging economies. We know this. I think India and China in particular are two markets where there's a lot of emissions growth in those markets. Looking at sort of my backyard, so I cover South Asia for climate change investments. We see India is probably accounting for about 90% of the emissions, GHG emissions in South Asia, a smaller amount with some of the neighboring countries. However, if you look at the countries being affected by climate change, a lot of these smaller countries are the ones that are being affected. So I think there's a real role, and we're looking at both GHG mitigation, we're looking at climate adaptation, we're looking at a number of different ways that we can address these problems. So what's our approach towards climate change? About 2 years ago, IFC actually created a separate climate business group in order to really target this area. We've been investing in climate change positive investments for some time now, but it's really trying to take this to the next level. So from the investment side, one of the success stories that we like to talk about is on the power side. So whereas most of the power business, 3 years ago was probably coal and coal-based power. It's now changed to about 70% renewables, so that's a pretty dramatic turnaround, and we continue to focus on renewables as a key aspect of our power strategy. I won't get into some of these other areas. On the advisory side, we're trying to do a lot of interesting work. In particular, we just launched the Lighting Asia program that was launched in India at the end of May. Some of the stats were quoted by Eric in his presentation, where we've seen off-grid solar as sort of a key area that can have dramatic development impact. About 400 million people without access to power in India alone, and we're trying to target that. And this is on the back of the Lighting Africa program, which has been very successful. So in India in particular, we're working with a number of different bodies, including the government, in order to do some standardization for solar lanterns and microgrids, working with a set of companies to help them with strategy so we can understand better the problems that these companies are facing, both from a capacity building, from a distribution aspect, and then we're working on a facility that we can add to this program to allow access to finance for end consumers or working capital for some of these vendors involved. So these are some of the things that we try and do to target these markets. The Climate Business Group that I mentioned has three broad areas. There's the Cleantech investment group that I'm a part of. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We've got the Climate Finance and Policy Group, which is partly think tank, partly looking at interesting kind of innovative financing that we can use to target the climate business. The Carbon Finance Fund that we raised, the €150 fund, that unfortunately was recently shut down because of the pricing in the market, but those are some of the things that we're trying to look at. And then we recently really ramped up our strategy and business development group, including 9 specialists right now that cover various sectors for us. And we find this very useful both from an investment standpoint as we try to evaluate some new technologies and markets, as well as from looking at overall strategies for countries and how we want to target different subsectors under the climate business. So this is the Cleantech investment group that I'm part of. I probably cannot read this slide, but we were established in 2010 calendar year. Since then, I think we've invested about 123 million across 14 companies. What we try and do, and this is very unique in terms of IFC, which is more known for project finance, for debt funding. What we try to do is first, as IFC is now shifting towards more of a balanced equity and debt investment culture, we're trying to lead the charge in terms of some of the investments that we're looking to make, in particular on earlier stage companies than IFC is normally used to dealing with, as well as clean technology. So in the past, if any smaller investments came in through the door and landed up in our power group, they would look at it, say too small, and move on. So our team, which most of us were initially investing in the IT sector, started looking at clean tech as well, and then a couple of years ago formed a dedicated group that is focused on clean tech. One of the things that we've done about 6 months ago is raise a $60 million clean tech innovation facility This allows us to make very early stage investments, including seed investments, and has a first loss associated from the Global Environment Fund that allows us to take more risk than we would normally do. So we continue again, push more from the development side, more on the frontiers in terms of new markets. And the goal is that once we make a few investments in a sector, we understand it better, it becomes mainstream, and then we go ahead and make large investments and provide all the different products that we tend to offer. This is a snapshot of where the investments we've made so far, all China and India so far, but we're looking at a number of investments in Turkey and Latin America, and hopefully in about a year you will see a more balanced side. I've talked through a couple of these in a moment. So in terms of IC versus typical funds, I think what we try and bring to the table is a lot of domain expertise. I talked about the specialists that we have. We also, by investing across different markets, our specialists tend to get a very nice global view of what's happening in terms of innovation, in terms of both from the technology as well as business model standpoint. Our global network, I mentioned 3,500 staff members across various countries, so it gives us a lot of feet on the ground, understanding of what's happening in key emerging markets. In terms of capital, we can invest everything from seed equity to senior debt. So it's very useful for companies, and we can support them through their life cycle. And then what we're doing now is really trying to focus on company building. So in the past, we were not really set up to do very active portfolio management. Our team is really focused on doing more of that. We're bringing in our advisory colleagues that I mentioned earlier to actually come and help with companies on specific activities to allow them to grow faster. These are some of the sectors that we're looking at. So 4 broad sectors: clean energy and access. That's where we've spent most of our time so far. We're starting to spend a lot more time now on green buildings, energy efficiency. Waste is another key area where we've got a specialist who's working on a strategy right now. And then agriculture and forestry is one where we made a couple of investments and looking to do a lot more. This is the South Asia portfolio. I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight which companies we've invested in so far. Terra Recycling is the e-waste recycling company in India, the only environmentally friendly one. It's an end-to-end recycling. It's backed by DFJ and a couple of local funds. Azure Power, backed by Foundation Capital and a local Indian fund, was the first private solar IPP. We invested in this company when the national solar mission was still being figured out. So took a very early bet on that in the company. I think they connected their first megawatt the day before I went to investment committee, so that was useful. And now they're crossing about 50 megawatts and growing very nicely, one of the leading players in the market. Sunborn, one of the CoStar Ventures companies that we committed to, and Applied Solar, the first green telecom company in India. They're providing a solar hybrid solution to telecom towers. We've got Capricorn and Bessemer Ventures in there with us. Huspower has been mentioned already by Bamboo. Cleantech, a recent investment we made a couple of weeks ago, our first smart grid investment. It's an area that we want to focus more on. We see a lot of potential because as the emerging markets in India in particular, there's a huge demand-supply deficit. Everyone's trying to plug that with renewables, yet you're losing anywhere from 10 to 70% of power due to faulty or whether it's theft or faulty distribution systems. So we think smart grid has a real play, although it's a nascent market with a lot to be done in order to make it successful. So Cleantech is our first investment there. We're looking at a second one right now. This is another 4 investments that we've made over the last couple of weeks actually. Renewagen Ventures is our first waste-to-energy investment that we've made in the region. They've got a project in Sri Lanka with municipal solid waste. So it's an area we're very keenly looking at, wearing our development hat. Dumping is a huge problem, power is a huge problem, so a company that comes in and can benefit both those areas while being successful is a big win for us. We also make fund investments, which I'll talk about in a moment on the next slide. Flareum is a company that's providing solar thermal products, initially solar cookers, both small for household as well as large that are used in schools and healthcare, hospitals, etc. And also is starting to move into Africa. So we've co-invested with one of our invested funds for this one. We have a very active fund investment program. I noted two new ones that we just made, areas which is focused on renewable. Infused capital, we've got other founding investors, BP Ventures, at the conference with us as well. This is again allowing us to focus on earlier stage investments that we normally make. So Infuse is an incubator / seed investor that's backed by BP Ventures, MNRE, which is the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy in India, and we're coming into and trying to help them raise about a $20-25 million fund and look at all clean tech markets, early stage entrepreneurs, and significant leverage our clean tech innovation facility and do more. Other fund investments, this again is a key part of our program. What we're trying to do is not only make our direct investments, but also invest through funds, and then co-invest with them in order to expand our footprint. So that's my presentation.